Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, January 10, 2025. President-elect Donald Trump is sentenced in his hush money case, but the judge's sentence is unconditional discharge, no punishment. He says because Donald Trump is about to be sworn in and assume the legal protections of the office of the President of the United States. President-elect Trump speaks before the sentencing, calling the case a political witch hunt to damage his reputation, and says the November election results show the American people agree. Coming up, we hear from Donald Trump. Also, the prosecutor Joshua Steinglass, who decries Donald Trump's attacks on the judicial system, and Judge Juan Merchan, who says the powers of the presidency are not able to erase a jury verdict. Supreme Court hears a challenge to the law banning the TikTok app from the U.S. if its Chinese parent company ByteDance does not divest. We'll hear some of the oral argument and talk with Zach Schoenfeld, the Hill's courts and legal reporter, about how the justices may rule. President Joe Biden gets another update on the response to the wildfires in Los Angeles from the California governor, Los Angeles mayor, and FEMA administrator. Jobs report for December. Labor Department says the U.S. added 256,000 jobs and the unemployment rate went down to 4.1%. And the Biden administration imposes new sanctions on Russia's energy industry designed to limit money Russia can use in its war against Ukraine. Associated Press writes that President-elect Donald Trump was formally sentenced Friday in his hush money case, but the judge declined to impose any punishment. The outcome cements Trump's conviction while freeing him to return to the White House unencumbered by the threat of a jail term or a fine. Trump's sentence of an unconditional discharge caps a norm-smashing case that saw the former and future president charged with 34 felonies, put on trial for almost 2 months, and convicted on every count. Yet the legal detour and the sordid details aired in court of a plot to bury affair allegations didn't hurt him with voters who elected him to a second term. That was from Associated Press. President-elect Trump spoke before the sentencing for about 6 minutes, saying he is innocent of the charges, and the voters in November confirmed his position. The case itself was orchestrated by his political opponents.
Would your client like to be heard?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. This has been a very terrible experience. I think it's been a tremendous setback for New York and the New York court system. This is a case that Alvin Bragg did not want to bring. He thought it was, from what I read and from what I hear, inappropriately handled before he got there. A gentleman from a law firm came in and acted as a district attorney, and that gentleman, from what I heard, was a criminal or almost criminal in what he did. It was very inappropriate. It was somebody involved with my political opponent. Part of the records that we're talking about, they're saying, I just noticed where he said I was falsifying business records. Well, the falsification of business records, as they said, was calling a legal expense in the books where everybody could see them, a legal expense. In other words, that legal fees or legal expense were put down as legal expense by accountants. They weren't put down by me, they were put down by accountants. I didn't call them construction, concrete work, I didn't call them electrical work, I didn't call them anything. They called a legal fee or a legal expense, and for this, I got indicted. It's incredible, actually. Now, if you look, my attorney alluded to it, the top legal scholars and legal pundits in this country, the ones that are quoted all the time on television, that are making their views felt, and highly respected people, have said, everyone, virtually everyone that I know of, haven't seen any to the contrary, not one. And these people are not exactly friends of mine, to put it mildly, but they all said this is a case that should have never been brought. It's an injustice of justice. Very respected Jonathan Turley, Andy McCarthy, Judge David Rifkin, a wonderful man who just passed away, by the way, Greg Jarrett, Ellie Honig from CNN, of all places. CNN said that, Paul Ingrassia, Alan Dershowitz, they all said this is not a case that should be brought. It's not, think about it, legal expenses are down as legal expenses, and I get indicted for business records. Everybody should be so accurate. It's been a political witch hunt. It was done to damage my reputation so that I'd lose the election, and obviously that didn't work. And the people of our country got to see this firsthand because they watched the case in your courtroom. They got to see this firsthand, and then they voted, and I won and got the largest number of votes by far of any Republican candidate in history, and won, as you know, all 7 swing states, won conclusively all 7 swing states, and won the popular vote by millions and millions of votes. And they've been watching your trial, so they understood it. I wasn't allowed to use the lawyer-client privilege or the reliance on counsel. I had a lawyer that made this deal, and he admitted that. And he was also a totally discredited person. We weren't allowed to use the information from the Southern District that totally discredited him. It wasn't allowed to be put in. And that was terrible, unbelievable. And this is a man who's got no standing. He's been disbarred on other matters, unrelated. And he was allowed to talk as though he were George Washington. But he's not George Washington. He shouldn't have been allowed. The Southern District did a book of approximately 28 pages where I've never seen anything like it. They excoriated him. You wouldn't let it be put into evidence. So he was able to testify as a witness, and I think it's a disgrace to the system. I was under a gag order. I'm the first president in history that was under a gag order where I couldn't talk about aspects of the case that are very important. I guess I'm still under, so probably I won't do it now. I assume I'm still under a gag order. But the fact is that I'm totally innocent. I did nothing wrong. They talked about business records, and the business records were extremely accurately counted. I had nothing to do with them. That was done by an accountant or a bookkeeper who I think gave very credible testimony and was corroborated by everybody that was asked. And with all that's happening in our country today, with a city that's burning to the ground, one of our largest, most important cities burning to the ground, with wars that are uncontrollably going on, with all of the problems of inflation and attacks on countries and all of the horrible things that are going on, I got indicted over calling a legal expense a legal expense. It was called a legal expense. I just want to say I think it's an embarrassment to New York, and New York has a lot of problems, but this is a great embarrassment. I believe that this and other cases that were brought, as you know, the DOJ is very much involved in this case. It's because that's the political opponent they're talking about. The DOJ is very involved. You have a gentleman sitting right there from the DOJ who was from the DOJ's office. He was also involved with the New York State Attorney General's case. And he went from there to here. He went around and did what he had to do. He got them to move on me. But in the meantime, I won the election in a massive landslide. And the people of this country understand what's gone on. This has been a weaponization of government. They call it lawfare. Never happened to any extent like this, but never happened in our country before. And I'd just like to exclaim that I was treated very, very unfairly. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Trump.
President-elect Donald Trump speaking virtually to the New York State Supreme Court sentencing hearing in his hush money case today. The judge imposed no punishment. NBC News writes Donald Trump was convicted in May of falsifying records related to hush money that his then attorney Michael Cohen paid adult film star Stormy Daniels in the closing days of the 2016 presidential campaign. Daniels testified that she had a sexual encounter with Donald Trump in 2006, which he has denied. That was from NBC News. Prosecutor in this case, Joshua Steinglass, also addressed the court before sentencing, saying Donald Trump's statements about this case, the government lawyers, and the judge have undermined the public's faith in the judicial system.
As this court has observed, quote, the sanctity of a jury verdict and the deference that must be accorded to it is a bedrock principle in our nation's jurisprudence. The defendant's conduct before, during, and after this trial also merits consideration. Instead of preserving, protecting, and defending our constitutionally established system of criminal justice, the defendant, the once and future President of the United States, has engaged in a coordinated campaign to undermine its legitimacy. Far from expressing any kind of remorse for his criminal conduct, the defendant has purposefully bred disdain for our judicial institutions and the rule of law. And he's done this to serve his own ends and to encourage others to reject the jury verdict that he finds so distasteful. He has characterized these proceedings as corrupt, rigged, a witch hunt, or a sham too many times to tabulate. The defendant's rhetoric has only ratcheted up since this court's rulings on his motions to dismiss. He has been unrelenting in his unsubstantiated attacks upon this court and its family, individual prosecutors and their families, the witnesses, the grand jury, the trial jury, and the justice system as a whole. The defendant has not only been held in contempt by other jurists in other matters, but this court alone found the defendant in contempt for 10 distinct violations of the order restricting extrajudicial speech. In his legal filings, the defendant has used dangerous rhetoric in leveling accusations of intentionally unlawful and unconstitutional conduct on the part of this court and the prosecution. As this court has noted, the defendant's conduct, quote, constitutes a direct attack on the rule of law itself. Moreover, the defendant has publicly threatened to retaliate against the prosecutors who have sought to hold him accountable in this and other matters, and the courts who have endeavored to fairly and faithfully adjudicate these matters. Such threats are designed to have a chilling effect, to intimidate those who have the responsibility to enforce our laws, in the hopes that they will ignore the defendant's transgressions because they fear that he is simply too powerful to be subjected to the same rule of law as the rest of us.
Joshua Steinglass with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office addressing the New York State Supreme Court in President-elect Trump's hush money case, the sentencing hearing. He also said that given the defendant will soon be President of the United States, the government supports the sentence the judge had earlier indicated he would impose: unconditional discharge, no jail, probation, fines, or other punishment.
The American public has the right to a presidency unencumbered by pending court proceedings or ongoing sentence-related obligations. But imposing this sentence ensures that finality. Sentencing the defendant permits this court to enter judgment, to cement the defendant's status as a convicted felon while he pursues whatever appeals he intends to pursue. And it gives full effect and respect to the jury's verdict while preserving the defendant's ability to govern.
Prosecuting attorney Joshua Steinglass. Donald Trump's attorney Todd Blanche also briefly addressed the New York court today and, like his client, said the case should never have been brought and noted that they will be appealing. Judge Juan Merchan spoke before imposing sentence, emphasizing that the trial was conducted pursuant to the same rules of procedure and law that applies to any other trial, and that in that sense it was ordinary. He also said what makes the case exceptional and leads to his sentencing decision is the legal protections attached to the office of the President of the United States, no matter who occupies it.
The considerable, indeed, extraordinary legal protections afforded by the office of the Chief Executive is a factor that overrides all others. To be clear, the protections afforded the office of the President are not a mitigating factor. They do not reduce the seriousness of the crime or justify its commission in any way. The protections are, however, a legal mandate which, pursuant to the rule of law, this court must respect and follow. However, despite the extraordinary breadth of those protections, one power they do not provide is the power to erase a jury verdict. It is clear from legal precedent which until July 1st was scarce, that Donald Trump, the ordinary citizen, Donald Trump, the criminal defendant, would not be entitled to such considerable protections. I'm referring to protections that extend well beyond those afforded the average defendant who winds their way through the criminal justice system each day. No, ordinary citizens do not receive those legal protections. It is the office of the president that bestows those far-reaching protections to the office holder. And it was the citizenry of this nation that recently decided that you should once again receive the benefits of those protections, which include, among other things, the Supremacy Clause and presidential immunity. It is through that lens and that reality that this court must determine a lawful sentence. After careful analysis, in obedience to governing mandates, and pursuant to the rule of law, this court has determined that the only lawful sentence that permits entry of a judgment of conviction without encroaching upon the highest office in the land is an unconditional discharge, which the New York State Legislature has determined is a lawful and permissible sentence for the crime of falsifying business records in the first degree. Therefore, at this time, I impose that sentence to cover all 34 counts. Sir, I wish you Godspeed as you assume your second term in office. Thank you.
Judge Juan Merchan of the New York State Supreme Court at today's sentencing hearing for Donald Trump in the hush money case in New York City. Donald Trump and his lawyer joining remotely. Washington Post writes President-elect Donald Trump lashed out at the New York judge who sentenced him on Friday to unconditional discharge in the hush money case in which he was found guilty of 34 felony charges, noting that the sentencing carries no fine, incarceration, or probation. Trump contended on his Truth Social platform that the result proves that there is no case, there never was a case. That from the Washington Post. CNN writes that Rudy Giuliani has been held in contempt of court for the second time in a week as the former New York mayor and top Donald Trump lawyer's fall from grace continues because of the false information he spread after the 2020 election. District Judge Beryl Howell's ruling Friday came as Giuliani continues to make false insinuations about two Georgia election workers long after they won a $150 million defamation verdict against him, and he agreed to stop slandering them. Howell said as she read her verdict, Mr. Giuliani engaged in the worst kind of defamation. It's outrageous and shameful. This takes real chutzpah, Mr. Giuliani, reporting from CNN. Rudy Giuliani spoke to reporters outside the courtroom in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Giuliani, are you going to ask Donald Trump for any help or money?
No, this has nothing to do with Donald Trump. What this has to do with is a complete abdication of the American legal system in the District of Columbia, and this judge might be primarily responsible for it. Remember, this is the J6 judge, January 6 defendant, who was annoyed that the other judges didn't give long enough prison sentences. Notice how she's dying to give me a prison sentence, even though it would be unconstitutional. But the most important and egregious thing that even you have to recognize if you have any fairness is I obviously didn't get a fair hearing. She had the thing prepared before we ever started. You can't read that 20, 30-minute thing with all of the citations in it and prepare it after I testified. She never even left the bench. So this is a put-up job. I wrote it before I went in. If you check my X account, I said there's going to be a phony case. She's going to have that decision prepared before I even go out and testify. I'm absolutely right because I know what a dishonest and dishonorable judge she is. I shouldn't be the one that's paying fines. I shouldn't be the one in contempt. She should be. And when somebody reviews what she did with J6, she has been a disgrace to the district court. This was a farce.
Rudy Giuliani, former Donald Trump lawyer, outside the court in Washington, D.C. And this is Washington Today.
We will hear argument this morning in case 24-656, TikTok versus Garland, and the consolidated case.
Chief Justice John Roberts starting off today's oral argument in the case over a law that would ban the TikTok short video app in the U.S. if its owner, Chinese company ByteDance, does not sell it to a non-Chinese entity. Joining us now to talk about the case is Zach Schoenfeld, The Hill's courts and legal reporter. Thank you for being with us. So we got First Amendment rights to free speech versus national security concerns. What did you hear today about which way the justices might go?
It seems coming out of this roughly 2.5-hour oral argument at the Supreme Court that they seem to be leaning towards the government here, expressing sympathy with these national security concerns over TikTok's Chinese-based parent company ByteDance. This is a monumental First Amendment case that'll impact the more than 170 million U.S. users of this video sharing platform. But in this seismic battle that pits free speech against national security, it seems that the justices are going towards the national security side of this.
What are the national security concerns? What are the details, the limits of this? Did this come up in the justices' questioning?
This has, of course, been the conversation of so much talk in Washington on the two political branches of government, now extending into two and into now Trump's will be the third administration. And so the Justice Department now, in defending this law, has been citing that years-long history, both in the presidency as well as Congress taking a close look at this. And those efforts, of course, ultimately culminated in Congress last spring passing this law that would require TikTok to either divest itself from its Chinese-based parent company or face a ban nationwide in the U.S. by January 19th. So in defending this law, the government really puts the national security concerns into two buckets. The first concern that they cite is saying that the Chinese government would potentially have the ability to access these U.S. users, their data, and the fact that TikTok just collects so much data on users who are using the video sharing platform. So that's bucket number one. And then the second bucket that they cite is they say that the Chinese government could, behind the scenes, covertly manipulate the TikTok content algorithm. So it's those two things combined that they say supersedes the free speech issue.
Justice Neil Gorsuch asked TikTok's lawyer today, Neil Francisco, about the extent of ByteDance's influence over TikTok and said the facts are in dispute. Was that resolved at all?
Yeah, I think that was one of the issues going into this oral argument is the fact that this case so far has not followed, how a normal lawsuit would be filed. Usually by the time a case gets to the Supreme Court, it's been heard by a federal district judge. It then goes to a circuit court on appeal, and then the Supreme Court is the third level. But the way that this law was designed had these challengers, which is both TikTok itself as well as some creators, they went right into the federal appeals court in Washington, D.C., the D.C. Circuit. And now we're very quickly at the Supreme Court. So there's a little bit less of a record from the courts below that you would normally have, and that leaves open certain factual questions over ByteDance's control over TikTok. That was really the subject of Justice Neil Gorsuch's questions. He acknowledged that he had to ask so many factual questions. But I think overall what we did hear from Justice Gorsuch is perhaps out of all 9 justices, he seems perhaps the most sympathetic towards TikTok's free speech concerns. So I don't think that we're necessarily, even though the Supreme Court overall gave TikTok a frosty reception, that's not to say that this is going to be a 9-0 decision.
We're talking with Zach Schoenfeld, courts and legal reporter for The Hill. There were 2 lawyers on TikTok's side, one for the company TikTok and one for a TikTok creator. Did the justice make any distinction between First Amendment rights between those 2?
Yeah, the First Amendment question is a little bit different depending on the specific challenger. So, for example, the government has contended that TikTok, the company, has no First Amendment rights here at all because of its foreign ownership. Now, TikTok has pushed back on that. They note that TikTok operates in the U.S. under a U.S.-based corporate entity. So they say that entity and the way it operates within the U.S., that it has First Amendment rights. So that affects the analysis. And then on the creator side, there's a question of the fact that this law is directly regulating and trying to ban TikTok, but whether, creators as people who post content to TikTok and create all of these short form videos, whether they are able to get involved here in this suit and whether they can bring First Amendment claims. So really a win for TikTok here could either come in ruling for the company or the slightly different First Amendment arguments that are being put forth by the individual creators.
Hypotheticals are often used in oral argument. What did you hear today?
There were quite a lot of hypotheticals in today's oral argument, really talking about all across the media industry. There were mentions of other social media platforms. Meta came up a few times. Its Reels program through Instagram is one of the main competitors to TikTok. We got some mentions of Elon Musk's social platform X, formerly known as Twitter. And then there was also some talk about the actual legacy mainstream media. So the hypothetical that we kept hearing a lot is Jeff Bezos and his ownership of the Washington Post. And TikTok's lawyers were the ones who actually posed this and questioned, what if TikTok loses here, what would then stop Congress, if they so wanted to prevent Jeff Bezos' ownership of the Washington Post, because he has, various foreign business interests. So we saw questions about that. There were even mentions about Politico, and it now has a foreign-based owner that's based in Germany. So a lot of hypotheticals posed today.
And finally, the deadline in the law for the sale of TikTok or have it banned from the U.S. is January 19th. Supreme Court has been asked to extend that, and they've got these issues about First Amendment rights versus national security. So what kind of decisions can we expect, and which way are they going to go, do you think?
The Supreme Court has been taking this case on a very expedited schedule. This case was only taken up just a few weeks ago. So that would suggest, so far at least the schedule, is that the justices are going to issue some sort of ruling before that January 19th deadline. Because if they say nothing and we get to 9 days from now, then this TikTok ban will go into effect unless it suddenly is able to divest itself from ByteDance. So that would lead to some expectation that the court is going to say something before the 19th. That could come in a few different fashions. We could see, a very fast put together a complete opinion on these First Amendment issues. It's also possible that they just issue a temporary stay, an emergency ruling that would last until we get, that full-fledged opinion. But that could then, give some more breathing room until later. And this timing also, of course, is important because we're having a changing administration in Washington. And once Donald Trump gets into office, he has said that he wants to negotiate a deal that he claims would somehow save TikTok and would negate the need for the Supreme Court to even rule on this matter. So simply, if the Supreme Court wants to issue a delay here and let Donald Trump get into office, there's a chance that they never have to answer this First Amendment question.
Zach Schoenfeld, courts and legal reporter for The Hill. Find his articles at thehill.com and on X at Zach A. Schoenfeld. Thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
And now some of today's Supreme Court oral argument in the TikTok case. Chief Justice John Roberts questioning Noel Francisco, attorney for TikTok and ByteDance.
Counsel, you began by saying this is a U.S. company operating in the United States.
Yes, Your Honor.
But the ultimate company that controls it, ByteDance, was found by Congress, and I quote this, to be subject to Chinese laws that require it to assist or cooperate with the Chinese government's intelligence work, quotes, and to ensure that the Chinese government has the power to access and control private data that the company holds. So are we supposed to ignore the fact that the ultimate parent is in fact subject to doing intelligence work for the Chinese government?
Well, Your Honor, I don't think you are supposed to ignore that at all, but I also don't think that it changes the analysis for a couple of reasons. Look, TikTok and...
Well, just hold a second. Well, as I said, you began by saying this is a U.S. company operating in the United States, and it seems to me that you're ignoring the major concern here of Congress, which was Chinese manipulation of the content and acquisition and harvesting of the content.
Sure. And I'll start by saying that TikTok Incorporated is a United States subsidiary operating in the United States with its own set of free speech rights.
Do you dispute the fact that ByteDance has ultimate control of TikTok in its corporate organization?
Yes, Your Honor, I do dispute that, but I also don't think that it matters, because even if China could exercise overwhelming power against TikTok versus ByteDance, I don't think it would change the analysis. And I can take that Washington Post hypothetical and ratchet it up a little bit to help illustrate the point. Let's suppose that the Chinese government had actually taken the Bezos children hostage, and it was using that leverage in order to force Bezos and the Washington Post to publish whatever they wanted on the front page of the Post. So China effectively has total control. I still don't think that Congress could come in and tell Bezos either sell the Post or shut it down, because that would violate Bezos's rights and the Washington Post rights. Maybe what they could do is come in and say, you need to disclose the fact that you're under this amount of coercion, so that the people who are looking at the paper understand it and can make their own assessment. But I think the First Amendment rights of both Bezos and the Post would be directly implicated, notwithstanding that China in that scenario has effectively total control over what gets printed in the Washington Post.
Noel Francisco, attorney for TikTok and parent company ByteDance, questioned by Chief Justice John Roberts in the oral argument in the consolidated Supreme Court cases TikTok v. Garland and Fireball v. Garland. U.S. Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar defended the constitutionality of the law that requires ByteDance to divest TikTok to a non-Chinese owner or face a ban on TikTok in the United States. Here questioned by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson.
General, isn't the whole point of the divestiture requirement that the content on TikTok would be different if it was owned by a different company? I'm still struggling with your insistence that this is content neutral versus content based when we have that kind of circumstance.
The reason that I am continuing to try to hold the line on that is because there is nothing in the Act that would directly dictate any different mix of content on TikTok. The U.S. subsidiary could use the same algorithm, show the same content by the same users in exactly the same order. It's not about trying to interfere with the U.S. subsidiary's exercise of editorial judgment in any relevant sense. Instead, all Congress was doing was homing in on the problems of having a foreign adversary be able to interject itself and be able to harvest the data.
But your friends on the other side say that the motivation for doing that is because the foreign adversary might influence or change the content. So content matters, doesn't it? I think that content was relevant to Congress's concern about an adversary having control over the communications channel. I think not, again, because of any particular concern about viewpoints or subjects, but just that this would be isn't that relevance enough to trigger at least some scrutiny, with a heightened scrutiny from the standpoint of our legal tests?
I certainly understand that intuition, and if the court thought that it were prudent to simply try to rule narrowly here and not dictate broader First Amendment principles, we have no problem with the court assuming that heightened scrutiny applies. We think the law easily satisfies it. We do think that intermediate scrutiny is a more appropriate framework for this kind of law that's not directly targeting protected speech. But in any event, there's a compelling national security interest here, and the law isn't just narrowly tailored, it's precisely tailored. It's trying to fix the thing that's creating the problem, which is the PRC's involvement and the Chinese government's ability to exercise this control over the corporate entities.
U.S. Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar, questioned by Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. You can find the full audio of today's oral argument in the consolidated cases TikTok v. Garland and Fireball v. Garland at our website, cspan.org. CNN writing about the law that would ban the app if the Chinese-based parent company doesn't not sell. The law is set to take effect on January 19th unless the High Court steps in to block it temporarily. A decision on that question, the ban's implementation date, could come quickly, long before the justices resolve any underlying questions about speech protections. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Witness democracy unfiltered with C-SPAN. Experience history as it unfolds with C-SPAN's live coverage this month as Republicans take control of both chambers of Congress, and a new chapter begins with the swearing in of the 47th President of the United States on Monday, January 20th. Tune in for our live all-day coverage of the presidential inauguration as Donald Trump takes the oath of office, becoming President of the United States. Stay with C-SPAN this month for comprehensive, live, unfiltered coverage of the 119th Congress and the presidential inauguration. C-SPAN. Democracy unfiltered.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. USA Today reports firefighters made progress Friday in the battle against a series of deadly wildfires that have decimated entire neighborhoods in Southern California, though officials caution that strong winds will return to the region raising the threat of further devastation. 5 wildfires remained active in Los Angeles County, scorching more than 36,000 acres, or about 56 square miles, an area about the size of Miami, according to CAL FIRE. The largest blaze, the Palisades Fire, which ranks as the most destructive in Los Angeles history, scorched over 20,000 acres and was 8% contained as of Friday morning. That reporting from USA Today. President Joe Biden received an update on the federal response in the White House Oval Office, joined by Vice President Kamala Harris and remotely by California Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, along with FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell.
Vice President Harris and I are about to receive a briefing from Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass and the FEMA Director Criswell. So both of them are on the ground leading the fight against this god-awful wildfires in worse than California history. And there's been some progress in the last 24 hours. So I want to give an update of where we think things are at the moment. First, overnight, local, state, and federal firefighters were able to partially prevent some of the largest fires from spreading into new areas. 3% in Pasadena has been kept from spreading, 8% in Pacific Palisades, 35% in Ventura, and 37% in Sylmar. But this time yesterday, these fires are mostly spreading out of control. We still got a long way to go, as we're out to hear from the governor and others. And while the winds have died down for the time, we expect they'll remain a threat until early next week. So we're going to keep working 24/7 to support state and local officials to fully stop these fires as soon as possible. Next, we're going to make sure California has every possible resource to fight these fires and help survivors. As soon as the fires started, I approved the Fire Management Assistance Grants, which is a fancy phrase for saying the grants to cover the cost of firefighting federally, and the gear, equipment, capabilities like search and rescue. Then I immediately approved of the governor's request a major disaster declaration, which will pay for things like debris removal, temporary lodging, and first responder overtime pay. Both of these, the grants and the declaration, usually cover 75% of the state's cost. But yesterday I directed the federal government will cover 100% of the state cost for 180 days. I also announced FEMA has turned on its Critical Needs Assistance Program. This program gives one-time payment of $750 to survivors so they can quickly purchase critical items like water, formula, gasoline, and prescription drugs. Now, survivors should go to disasterassistance.gov or call 1-800-621-3362. We can't help you if we don't know you need the help. So call disasterassistance.gov, contact or call 1-800-621-3362. And I want to be clear, this is not the only aid the survivors can request from FEMA. More programs are going to be available through the disaster declaration, but this assistance that survivors can get now and get it fast.
President Joe Biden in the White House Oval Office. LA Times writes that Governor Gavin Newsom sent a letter to President-elect Donald Trump on Friday inviting the incoming leader to California to meet with fire victims, survey the devastation in LA County, and join him in thanking first responders. The invitation, which the governor's office said was emailed to Trump's team, marks a change in tone in the political battle between Newsom and Trump. Newsom said, in the spirit of this great country, we must not politicize human tragedy or spread disinformation from the sidelines. Trump has been a vocal critic of Newsom since the fires began and blamed the governor and his Los Angeles crew for the disaster. That was from the LA Times. Governor Newsom did join the briefing today remotely to the White House Oval Office and talked about misinformation.
We've got to deal with this misinformation. There were hurricane force winds of mis and disinformation, lies. People want to divide this country, and we're going to have to address that as well. And it breaks my heart as people are suffering and struggling that we're up against those hurricane forces as well. And that's just a point of personal privilege that I share that with you because it infects real people that are out there, people I meet every single day, people the mayor's been meeting with. And they're having conversations that are not the typical conversations you'd have at this time. And you wonder where this stuff comes from. And it's very damaging as well. But we're here to get the job done.
Governor Gavin Newsom joining virtually the White House Oval Office briefing. He mentioned the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, was also there and also spoke about the immediate battle against the wildfires and protecting life, the highest priority. Mayor Bass also talked about another issue dealing with the recovery, and that is fire insurance.
One of the biggest challenges that is facing us, and I also know that it is a national situation, is insurance. And so today I'm here at the County Hall of Administration. We do 2 press conferences a day, one in the county, one in the city, and we had our state insurance commissioner here. We do have a state plan, but that state plan certainly needs to be increased. He talked about introducing emergency legislation to respond to some of the ways we need to strengthen our system. So many of the homes in the area, especially in the Palisades area, had their insurance canceled a year or so ago. And he talked about how he wanted to have a moratorium. He was going to use the power of his office to have a moratorium that said that no policies can be canceled even if your home was not damaged. If you're in the area and everybody around you burned down, but your home was not damaged, that your policy cannot be canceled.
Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass joining from California virtually to the White House Oval Office briefing on the wildfires. Article in The Guardian about the fires reads, with estimates of the economic damage from the fires now reaching $52 to $57 billion, consumer advocates and veterans of past disasters say homeowners can expect weeks or months of paperwork to prove that they have lost what they say they have lost, if not also pressure from claims adjusters and a whole class of disaster professionals to make a quick settlement for less than they're entitled to under their policies. That from The Guardian. After the updates from Mayor Bass, Governor Newsom, and also FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell, President Biden answered a couple of questions on the response to the wildfires.
You mentioned yesterday that you're about to leave office. Are you coordinating with the incoming administration about this federal response?
Everything they know, every single thing we're doing about the response. My hope is that they'll have at least acknowledged we have some significant experience in this. We've done really well on it, and I'm praying that they continue to focus.
Mr. President, have you been told that the loss of life is likely to increase significantly in California?
It is likely it will increase. Whether significantly or not, we don't know yet. There's still a lot of people who are unaccounted for. We don't know where they are. I think this toll is likely to go up, whether it's significant or not. Pray God it's not, but it could be.
Can you specify what you're looting, Mr. President?
Pardon?
How concerned are you about looting, incidents of looting in Los Angeles?
We are concerned. That's why I provided more police officers and more military. Look, the DOD is in full bore with this. We're providing everything from security through the military, the National Guard, supplementing the National Guard, because there's clear evidence that there's looting. There's clear evidence that people are going into these even places where they're evacuated, and it's not all rubble, and people are going in and they're looting. And so we know that will continue unless we make sure we're providing the help to prevent it from happening.
President Biden in the White House Oval Office. Story from Politico's E&E News. Congress may not consider new aid for California to deal with its devastating spate of wildfires until mid-March, when Capitol Hill faces its next government funding deadline. Lawmakers see March 14th, the spending deadline, as the next chance to address any emergencies that may need congressional cash, including the blazes sweeping through Los Angeles County. House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Republican of Louisiana, said they'd address it at that negotiation, not in an upcoming budget reconciliation bill. Reporting from E&E News. From Fox Business, the U.S. economy added jobs more rapidly than expected in December, as Federal Reserve policymakers are keeping close tabs on the strength of the labor market ahead of their meeting later this month. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre brought this up at her news conference.
I did want to highlight some good news we received this morning. The final jobs report for the Biden-Harris administration was released today, and a remarkable 250,000 jobs were created last month, defying expectations. Additionally, the unemployment rate ticked down to a low of 4.1%. This is the only administration to gain jobs every month we had 0 months with job losses. This was no accident. President Biden's administration has delivered the strongest recovery in the world and laid a strong foundation for years to come by investing in America, empowering workers and unions, lowering costs, and supporting small businesses. Over 16.6 million jobs created, the lowest average unemployment rate of any administration in 50 years. Record high employment rates for working age women, and lowest black-white unemployment gap on record. Inflation down faster than almost any other advanced economy, and incomes up almost $4,000. And again, this was no accident. This is because of the president's leadership.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre at her news conference at the White House. Headline at CNBC, Dow tumbles nearly 700 points Friday as strong jobs report casts doubt over Fed's rate cut path. The Dow was down 696, NASDAQ down 317, S&P down 91. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, known as ATF, held a farewell program today for ATF Director Stephen Dettelbach, who plans to resign a few days before President-elect Trump is sworn in. Donald Trump told members of the National Rifle Association last year that if he's elected president, on day one we will sack the radical gun grabber Steve Dettelbach. Steve Dettelbach spoke today highly about the ATF, its mission, and its workforce.
Whether it's using RICO on gang cases or harvesting crime gun intelligence like never before to catch trigger pullers, or doing advanced undercover work to bust up a motorcycle gang, or revolutionizing ballistic touch DNA, or cracking down on illegal ghost guns, or busting southbound cartel traffickers, or completing thorough and fair inspections to make sure everybody's following the same set of rules, or working with academics and industry to try to address 3D printed switches, or stopping illegal sales without background checks, no matter where they are done. At ATF, we do everything we legally can to drive down violent crime. Let me tell you something about ATF for those of you who are visitors here today. Something I learned long ago and I saw as director. This building, this is not a memo writing place. This is a law enforcement place. That's what it has been, that's what it is now, and that's what it's always going to be. And by the way, it saves lives, as the crime done data that you heard prove. And ATF and the men and women here deserve all the support and the funding that highly effective, proven law enforcement should get.
ATF Director Steve Dettelbach at a farewell program today in Washington. He became the director in the summer of 2022 and will step down right before President-elect Trump takes office January 20th. There's a story from The Hill. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, Republican of Colorado, and Congressman Eric Burleson, Republican from Missouri, introduced a bill to abolish the ATF. They announced Tuesday the bill titled Abolish the ATF aims, quote, to safeguard Americans' Second Amendment rights and to protect law-abiding gun owners from the relentless bureaucratic overreach of the ATF, according to a press release from Burleson's office, reporting from The Hill. From Reuters, U.S. President Joe Biden's administration imposed its broadest package of sanctions so far, targeting Russia's oil and gas revenues on Friday in an effort to give Kyiv and Donald Trump's incoming team leverage to reach a deal for peace in Ukraine. The move is meant to cut Russia's revenues for continuing the war that has killed or wounded tens of thousands and reduced cities to rubble since Moscow invaded Ukraine in February 2022. That was the article from Reuters. The White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby spoke about this in the teleconference.
Our next question will go to Alex Ford.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. Just, I mean, we were talking about the market conditions. I mean, would it be fair to say that the Biden administration waited or didn't execute these kinds of sanctions earlier in the war because they were worried about gas prices going too high, and now this is a moment in which gas prices are low enough, and if they go higher, that's on Trump? And then the second bit is the administration hoping that these sanctions can prove a bargaining chip for Ukraine should there be peace talks with Russia coming soon, as you guys expect there to be?
Both are great questions, Alex. I don't think it would be fair to characterize the decision as trying to lay a bargaining chip on the table. Again, this was really based on market conditions and taking a look at how much more resilient both sets of markets are. I mean, domestic and overseas, and particularly when it comes to global oil. And so the time was propitious for this decision, and that's why the president made it. It wasn't about trying to tie the next administration down one way or the other. It wasn't done with calculations that it's a bargaining chip that can be taken off the table should Ukraine want to go to the table. There's no expectation right now that either side is ready to negotiate. And then as your first question, of course, domestic gas prices played into this decision. As I mentioned at the opening, I mean, the price is now just over $3 a gallon across the country, came down more than $1 here. So certainly the domestic oil market and its resilience and its stability right now certainly played into this decision.
Sure, but just to be very clear, I mean, does this mean this decision on going after Russian oil as hard as you guys are doing now, was that pushed off because gas prices were higher earlier and you didn't necessarily want to make them even higher for the American people?
Of course.
John Kirby is White House National Security Communications Advisor holding a teleconference. Story from AP, about 600,000 Venezuelans and more than 200,000 Salvadorans already living in the United States can legally remain another 18 months, the Department of Homeland Security said Friday, barely a week before President-elect Donald Trump takes office with promises of hardline immigration policies. The decisions mark the Biden administration's latest in support of temporary protected status, which he has sharply expanded to cover about 1 million people. TPS faces an uncertain future under Trump, who tried to sharply curtail its use during his first term as president. The announcement, which came as Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro took office for a third 6-year term in Caracas amid widespread international condemnation, is, quote, based on the severe humanitarian emergency the country continues to face due to political and economic crises under the Maduro regime, the department said, reporting from AP. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's free evening newsletter Word for Word and get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night and weekend.